Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
With access to democracy. Well, we're back with access to democracy several times. And we have a return guest, a frequent guest. Every time there's turmoil in the Middle East, we have Steve Hunegs here as our guest. He's the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. And I say every time there's turmoil in the Middle East, we call on Steve, so he may become a regular on this show because it seems there's constantly turmoil in the Middle East, and this week has been no exception. Now, you just had an article this week in the Star Tribune. Palestinian hopes lie with the U.S., not the UN. What are you saying?
To begin, thanks for having me on the show, Alan. I really appreciate you
Always
and
a
Sharon
pleasure.
having me on the show. And to our viewers, Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, Happy and Healthy New Year for everyone. Let's start from that premise.
Let's hope so. And peace.
And peace. Most of all,
peace, yeah.
Peace. And that's a good segue for my piece, is peace, because November 29, 1947, 70 years ago, there was an opportunity for a two-state solution, right? The United Nations divided the Palestine Mandate into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Unfortunately,
we're still waiting.
65 years, by the way. My math was wrong.
No, as a matter of fact, today is 71 years since Pearl Harbor.
Since Pearl Harbor Day. So
yeah.
So there's a great story in the Star Tribune, haven't had a chance to read it yet. The thrust of the piece that I wrote was the road to peace is between Ramallah and Jerusalem, not between Ramallah and the United Nations headquarters in Manhattan. The road to peace in Ramallah and Jerusalem runs through Washington. You can look at the history of Middle East diplomacy, particularly since the Six-Day War and especially since the 73 war. And the United States is the necessary and indispensable partner to Israel and the Palestinians, Israel and Jordan, Israel and Egypt. It is the one remaining great superpower in the world, but also the party with which most of the nations in the Middle East will deal with.
And we have a democracy in Israel. I certainly have been supportive of Israel. I spent a war in Israel, but I am certainly not a person who's happy with the present government that's running Israel, because I find them much too right-wing and much too aggressive for me. I don't think that Netanyahu wants peace. I think he wants to be reelected, and I think that's his primary concern. I had the same problem with some right-wingers in this country in the last 2012 election, who I think put their own self-interest above their obligation to the country. So we have another turmoil in the Middle East right now. Egypt is going through what they went through 2 years ago. What do you see happening there?
Let's take your comments in reverse order. So let's start with Egypt, okay? It's as though the letter has changed, or I should say the other letters have changed, Mubarak to Morsi, but the situation hasn't changed, in the sense that, again, an Egyptian leader is attempting to gain, some would say, autocratic power in a time of what he declares to be an emergency, and there's a great protest from the street. So
what
much
I
so that
see
there's
is
violence.
even more dangerous than Mubarak, who was despotic, yes, but secular. Morsi is obviously of the same ilk, but he's also bringing in Islamic law, which is really what's frightening the people there.
That and the people with whom he's associating Egypt. What was one of Morsi's first trips? To Iran. Who did Morsi invite to the Gaza Strip? Oh, excuse me. Take that back. The foreign minister of Egypt went to visit in the Gaza Strip, helping to incite an even heavier barrage of missiles from Gaza into Israel, which precipitated the conflict in the first place. The response of Israel to that may have chastened Morsi a bit, because to his credit, by the way, he was a helpful player in ultimately arriving at the truth. Probably playing a double game. He has his own domestic constituency. He knows from where he comes. He knows that anti-Israelism is very popular, particularly in the Muslim Brotherhood. He appreciates the fact that the peace between Egypt and Israel was between leaders, never between peoples. So he doesn't have to suffer much politically to encourage anti-Israel feeling in Egypt. However, that endangers his critical relationship with the United States, for whom his government, whether it's a fundamentalist Islamic Brotherhood government, Muslim Brotherhood government, or a secular government, they depend upon assistance from the United States to stabilize their economy, particularly in a period after the first, shall we call it a revolution, from 2 years ago, which certainly hampered their tourism trade. Lost a lot of money in that period.
Israel also depends on us,
of course,
for support and for
and I think
monetary and psychological.
And then your point that you're making, I think when you're referring to is your unease with the Netanyahu government, I would differ with you. I would think every Israeli government ever has been interested in peace. And keep in mind, it was Begin, a more conservative prime minister, who made the peace with Egypt, welcomed Sadat to Jerusalem, stepped outside his comfort zone at that time.
Because it was Rabin who really got the closest, in my mind, who was assassinated by a right-winger in Israel.
Netanyahu, of course, at Y Valley in 1997, assigned on to 2 states for 2 peoples. So at least formally, all Israeli politicians, elected officials of any substance or any stature, favor a 2-state solution. Certainly can't say that on the other side. There are many people in the United States and Israel who are unhappy with the decision, the E1 road between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adudim.
And what happened? We had the attacks of missiles raining down on Israel. The response, once the ceasefire comes in, and you had a good article about the ceasefire, is that Netanyahu says, now we're building 30,000 more homes in E1, which is, to me, a clear provocation.
Let's keep everything in context. I think to answer your question,
it's not easy.
It's not easy. Let's go back to the beginning, in the sense that where we started this discussion with the partition vote. At that time there were no settlements, unless, of course, you wanted to consider all of the Zionist enterprise or the Jewish enterprise in mandatory Palestine to be a settlement. But in that sense, well before anybody even thought of an E1 road or the Palestinian Authority and the negotiations since 1993 and the like, the Arabs refused to countenance the Arab Higher Committee on behalf of the Palestinian people, a Jewish state. So the idea that settlements are the main obstacle to peace is not supported by history.
Many of them still refuse to acknowledge a Jewish state.
So let's.
we have a peace with Jordan. We had a peace with Egypt, which I think probably still exists to some degree. Syria under Assad has always been a corrupt and dangerous country. They invaded Lebanon and took it over, so we certainly couldn't count on Lebanon. Saudi Arabia has pretty much been hands-off, but they haven't been really friends of Israel.
No, Israel lives in a dangerous neighborhood, to say the least. The point, though, about it's so interesting, there's so many levels of detail. The protest, including, if you want to call it that, 2 articles in the New York Times today, Maureen Dowd and Tom Friedman, both excoriating Netanyahu for the road and the settlements. But someone as knowledgeable and authoritative as Dennis Ross, this was also in the press today, will show you that the E1 route will not prevent the establishment of a contiguous Palestinian state. Okay? I think that's more or less fact. That said, others will argue, even if that is fact, Netanyahu's timing was suspect, to say the least, as you correctly point out, after the successful implementation of Iron Dome, which was a joint American-Israeli project, the complete support of the administration
Speak
for
of Friedman.
Netanyahu.
Friedman had a great column, and I have it in front of me here. Iron Empires, Iron Fists, Iron Dome. It was in the Times 2 days ago. And speaking of Iron Empires, what used to control the Muslim countries, Iron Fists, the dictators that they had, and now Iron Dome, this incredible self-defense mechanism that the Israelis have come up with, which apparently took down about 80% of the missiles that were fired at them.
About 80% of the missiles that Iron Dome deemed were a risk to populated areas.
Right.
And it's true, Iron Dome, have to give a lot of credit to our country, the United States, strongly supported the construction and financially supported it, development I should say, of Iron Dome.
When I was there in Operation Desert Storm, the Persian Gulf War, we had Patriot missiles, and they were much less effective, let's put it that. And they were also manned by Americans.
American soldiers at that time.
Some of whom went over on the plane that I went over on, although they were wearing shirts that said IDF, Israel Defense Force, and they all said that they were with the IDF, but it's hard to maintain that when you have a southern drawl. But
So shalom you all. It's interesting, you and I had the same experience because I was also in Israel during the 91 war, and it was such a surreal experience. Maybe you had the same one. Going and visiting one of the Patriot bases or deployments, installations, that's the word I'm looking for, was right near Jaffa. Just sitting right there. My friend and I drove up right and talked to the soldiers.
Yeah.
Primarily African-American soldiers there. And who would have thought, here we were in 1991 in Israel, Iraq firing Scuds at Israel, talking to black soldiers helping to defend Israel. It was a remarkable situation, but as you correctly point out, now the Iron Dome is deployed by Israeli soldiers.
And it's a whole different world now.
It's a much different world.
The Arabs have missiles, and they have long-range missiles, and they showed through this provocation that they're not afraid to use them.
It's Prime Minister Harper, even Prime Minister Harper, Israel's had no better friend in the world, practically, than Canada during the time, during the prime ministry of Stephen Harper. Even he called Netanyahu and expressed his displeasure at the building plans, all of which I understand. That said, all due respect to Mr. Friedman, a great graduate of St. Louis Park High School, who wrote a lovely column about St. Louis Park High School, my alma mater.
I saw that
a couple months ago, and to Maureen Dowd, and maybe even to Prime Minister Harper for that matter, spending a lot of time being critical of Israel at a time when 40,000 Syrians have died at the hands of their own government, at a time when Iran continues, A, its march towards nuclear weapons, B, to facilitate the slaughter of Syrians in Syria, C, to be the benefactor of Hamas and Hezbollah, 2, yes, I understand, and particularly many Israelis, center and left, many American Jews, thought the timing was suspect and perhaps ungrateful. But to call it a serious obstacle to peace might be an overstatement.
I also really was upset by Netanyahu's almost insertion into our presidential campaign. I mean, he made it clear that he favored Romney. I understand that he knows Romney for many years, but I felt that it was really inappropriate to have him injecting himself into our presidential race.
You and I probably won't disagree from the proposition that Americans should stay out of Israeli politics, and Israelis should stay out of American politics. Everybody's better off for it.
I think everybody should be able to, which is not what Sheldon Adelson says, but that's a whole different ballgame.
Different story there, but in Israel, when we're talking about democracy, in the United States, we're talking about democracy, and of course that's one of the cornerstones of the American-Israeli relationship, is the fact that both nations are democracies. you look around the Middle East, Egypt has its democracy, if that's what you want to call it.
Very tenuous
to say the least.
Democracy.
And then you'll look long and hard to find anything else even mildly resembling a democracy in the Middle East. Lebanon has a very fragile democracy, but there the exception sort of proves the rule, because Hezbollah there has been trying to strangle that democracy for a long time.
And there are some very bad players in the Middle East.
Very bad players. You start with Iran.
And different groups also of very bad players. It's bad enough that you have the Sunnis and the Shiites that hate each other, and then the Kurds become, in some respect, victims of that. But Iran is just a bad, as you say, a bad player. I say they're an evil empire.
Well, indeed. I mean, so much of the trouble in the Middle East is in Persian hands, not Arab hands, Persian hands. Because after all, the Iranians are Persians.
Right.
They're not Arabs. I mean, the Arabs have their own issues with the Israelis and with Jews over time.
One of my best friends, his family, were originally Persians.
Exactly. And I don't believe, and I think most serious scholars will tell you, they don't believe Iranians have the level of animosity towards Israel that their theocratic leadership does. And they certainly don't have it for the United States. The United States, on the streets of Tehran, according to scholars, Americans are very popular. The United States is very popular.
That's what I've seen, and I've seen that people try to emulate a lot of what they see from this country. Much of it is suppressed by a theocratic government. Much of it is suppressed by really a maniacal Ahmadinejad. But it's still the Ayatollah who wields the greatest power, and I don't know what he's wedded to, but it's not anything that's going to help Israel or the United States, for that matter.
Or stability in the Middle East.
Certainly.
And you look, I mean, some would say the Iranians have played their hand very well. No one can ignore Iran in the Middle East for a non-Arab, particularly for a non-Arab nation, a Persian nation. It's 80 million people with a long, proud, distinguished history, 2,500, 3,000 years old, where so much culture and science and civilization grew up in the Persian Empire. And now to see this de-evolution over time, starting in the late 70s, particularly marked by the takeover of the United States Embassy in 79, just reminds you sort of the peril and the promise. If they wanted, of course, the Iranians could be very helpful in the Middle East. But for whatever reason, they've chosen to go the diabolical route and develop nuclear weapons and be a patron of Hamas and Hezbollah, and according to the State Department, be the #1 supporter of state-sponsored terror in the world. That's not a very happy record.
We've seen indications of that, and I think the assassination of 5 Israelis in England, I think at the time of the Olympics, was directly attributed to terrorists who came out of Iran.
Well, they've attacked Israeli diplomats in Georgia, the former Soviet Union. Georgia, in South America, most likely they were behind the attack on the Israeli embassy in 1992 in Buenos Aires, the Jewish Community Center in 1994.
Which 95 people died, I believe.
A very large number behind the attack on the barracks in the United States Embassy in Beirut. Hundreds of Marines died, 283 Marines died.
It's strange to me that a country would take that route rather than, especially one that's espousing religion, rather than one which leads to a path of peace. And what do most people want? What do most Iranians want? What do most Israelis want? They want peace. What do most of the Palestinians want? They want peace. Most of them. It's the governments who get voted in, for instance, in Israel, out of fear, I think, out of protection, out of self-defense in some respects. But I think the people primarily want peace. The vote in Israel for a two-state solution is overwhelming.
It is. American Jews, Israelis, all when asked, in large numbers say they favor a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Of course, Israel has an election approaching. A lot of machinations right now in Israeli politics.
Which is another thing that's been attributed to Netanyahu building in E1 because of the support he can garner for his re-election.
I can't comment because I don't know enough on his political motivations, but certainly it's creating a lot of comment in Israel. Just read the Times of London, Haaretz, Ma'ariv, whatever it is that you want to read, Jerusalem Post, and left, right, and center.
There just is no really good, solid opponent running against him, so I don't see how he's not going to win overwhelmingly.
Well, the left center seems to be somewhat fractured. The Kadima party, Tzipi Livni's party, is more or less now a shell because she's starting Hatua, the movement party. They are Amir Peretz, who was the defense minister. Some would credit him, by the way, of being the sort of the father of Iron Dome. Has now switched from Labor over to Tzipi Livni's new party. So some are seeing sort of an erosion of support of Labor.
But I think she started too little, too late.
Right, and Shelley Yakimovich, the Labor leader, is not seen as potentially strong leader of the Labor Party. But most people will say what you're seeing is simply division into different quarters of the parties in opposition to Netanyahu, no gain or no loss, simply reshuffling the deck, so to speak. I think most observers conclude that Netanyahu is in a fairly strong position going into this election.
Yeah, one of the things we haven't talked about as we have dissected the Middle East here is the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, which obviously is concerned with world peace and the Middle East. But what's the function? What do you people do? How do you do it?
Let's say a given, sometimes a week. If you look at the work we do over a given week, it might give you a taste of our activities. For instance, we're a very proud partner in Minnesota Food Share, along with Catholic Charities, St. Paul Area Council of Churches, Greater Minneapolis Council of Churches, JCRC, Minnesota Catholic Conference. In the sequesterization process, as well as some of the negotiations, and as part of the re-upping, so to speak, the renewal of the Farm Bill, there's a lot of concern about food supports, and the like, called the SNAP program. So all of us recently sent a letter to our congressional delegation, most notably Representative Peterson, who's the senior member of the minority on the committee, urging him to protect SNAP. This is something that's very important to people in Minnesota who have trouble, as painful as it is, trouble having enough to eat every day. It's astonishing in this country,
and
such plenty.
The number of Minnesotans who really are below the poverty level, notwithstanding the fact that we all are as comfortable as we are, we forget the fact that there are thousands and thousands of kids who don't get enough to eat in this state.
In this state. Sarah Nelson Pallmeyer, who's the executive director of Minnesota Food Share, had this comment at our last partners meeting saying food shelves used to be primarily for people in emergency circumstances, okay? They lost a job and for a short period of time they needed help, whatever the case may be. It's now the grocery for many people. That is, people so long in poverty they can only afford to go to the food shelf. And that's a change. That's a metamorphosis in people's use of the food shelf. So that's something that's very important to us. Last month we had a program at the American Swedish Institute on the occasion of celebrating or commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the birth of Raoul Wallenberg.
Yeah, Raoul Wallenberg, who saved thousands of Jews during World War II.
Exactly, in Budapest. It was
at great cost to himself, ultimately his life.
Murdered by the Russians.
When he really wasn't a diplomat, but he was thrust into a role where he did things that were incredibly courageous. and saved so many people.
What we celebrated with our dear friends at the American Swedish Institute was a man who was remarkably audacious and creative and fearless in the face of Eichmann. Eichmann was literally on the ground in Budapest. In the fall of 1944, the last surviving community of any size in Nazi-occupied Europe was the Jewish community in Budapest. And Eichmann, in his demented way, was determined to send that community to Auschwitz, as he had done for 1 million other Jews as part of 6 million killed. And it was, in many ways, Wallenberg, in association with other neutral diplomats. One cannot forget that the Portuguese and the Swiss and other Swedes participated in saving the Jews of Budapest. But many thousands, tens of thousands, were saved because of the effort, and that's what we celebrated together. This is also the year, on January 1, 2013, where we celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. So we've been part of an effort with the African American community, in particular the Minnesota African American Museum, in celebrating. I use the word celebrating a little bit loosely because, of course, the trajectory of civil rights in the United States has not always been in a linear fashion. It's
has
been
a
up
long
and down.
way to go.
It has a long way to go, and there's been many struggles through it.
Also been active with the gay community in some respects.
Well,
you have also been active in terms of the amendments that were proposed for this last election. What I'm saying is yours is really a not only an aggressive public relations thrust, but you're also an organization of social conscience.
Yes, we have a birthright in civil rights in the sense that our community, particularly in Minneapolis, knows what it's like to be marginalized, particularly in the 1930s and the 1940s, along with the African American community and the Japanese American community. This past Tuesday had a lovely celebration of the life of Josie Johnson. Josie's 80, 85 years old. Hope I'm not telling secrets out of school, but she has been, one of the great pioneers of civil rights in Minnesota. And the opportunity for me to go back to the Urban League offices, which are on the north side of Minneapolis, which at one time was the heart of the Jewish community of Minneapolis, in order to participate in this celebration organized by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, was really a thrill. And I'm glad I had the chance to go.
And we also have run through 30 minutes.
It's astonishing. We didn't even talk about the twins.
We didn't talk about the twins. We didn't talk about a lot of things, but it's always an education to speak with Steve Hunegs, and we'll see you back soon, I hope. Wish you a happy Hanukkah.
Thank you.
A happy holiday season, and the best for the new year. May there be peace.
May there be peace.
Next year in Jerusalem.
Well, I always appreciate the opportunity to come on the show. Thank you very much, and I hope people will buy the book about the wonderful Toby.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.